Hello and welcome to this virtual edition of the Atlantic Dialogues, sponsored by the Policy Center of the New South. Thank you to everyone joining us today. We will be discussing public health, a new field of action for military organizations and alliances. Joining me from around the globe, we have Gabriele Cascone. He's the head of the NATO Counter-Terrorism section. We also have Barre Seguin. He's the NATO senior mentor at SHAPE, which is the supreme headquarters of Allied powers in Europe, and Juan Battaleme, the academic director of CARI, which is the Argentine Council of Foreign Relations. Unfortunately, the AUC's Michel Ndiaye will not be joining us. Now, for an opening question, I would like to ask the panelists, I have been reading for years reports from the military and the intelligence community warning of a global pandemic, but arguably no nation was prepared for the scope of COVID-19. Were military alliances or militaries in particular more ready than the rest of us? Gabriele, would you like to kick off?
Well, thank you very much. Well, that's a very good opening question and clearly not an easy one. I think I would not say that military alliances were more ready than other nations or organizations, and I agree with you. It's also been a bit of a small obsession of mine. Every time that somebody defines COVID-19 as a black swan, I always say, no, it's not a black swan, because we have seen for years reports saying there will be a global pandemic. The problem, we did not know when. And the problem, I think, is that nations and organizations face multiple crises simultaneously. And this, in a sense, hampers probably your ability to respond to the crisis, which you know could be somewhere down the road, but you don't know exactly where. It's also important, I think, to underline that for NATO or for a military alliance, one like the one that I work for, the response to the military pandemic and how to react to that was not at the very beginning part of its core business or its core raison d'etre. So the question is what you can do once you face it, but when you are a security and military organization, you have probably other more immediate issues on which you need to focus. That will be for me. Thank you.
Got it. So Barry, over to you. Should we have been more prepared?
Yeah. Thanks, Kim. And first off, appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel today with such distinguished speakers, as well as those that are joining us from around the world. And thank you for moderating. And it's a pleasure to be together again. I think in order to answer that question, you've got to look at it from a historical context, particularly going back over, I would say, the last 20 years when it comes to both military preparedness in terms of individual nations, but also in terms of alliances. And, you know, Gabriele had a great point about the raison d'etre of NATO, and that is certainly applicable. But as you look at it more broadly, I think if you go back 20-ish years, you can look at nations, particularly within NATO, kind of pivoting, if you will, to win, to slash fight and win today's war, which was kind of the mantra for a number of years, you know, reference Iraq and Afghanistan from there. And so we really had an irregular warfare, if you will, emphasis. We're competing for scarce resources within our respective nations and as an alliance as a whole. And so, you know, Gabriele aptly stated, it didn't reach the top priority, if you will. Since then, if you look historically, we have transitioned more so to a readiness focus based on the need to deter and defend in the era of what we're calling great power competition. And so we were in that transition, arguably, as COVID became a pandemic. But what I would say is that is not central to what militaries typically prepare for, that what militaries have inherent in them make them inherently prepared. We may have been, though, I think, as nations and as an alliance, slow to leverage those capabilities, and those, include foundational efforts that provide a menu of flexible responses and capabilities. Central to that being the ability to command and control, not only within a nation, but more broadly for a group of nations when it comes to an alliance. And also the inherent ability to transport and to transport to the point of need. And so how do we do that with personnel, with supplies? Do nations do it individually, or do they contribute those capabilities to the alliance? So there's a lot that is already there and available. It's a matter of aligning it properly, getting nations' commitment to either commit it to the alliance, to an alliance, and or to provide it as support to civil authorities who have the primary in most nations task with responding to these kind of medical challenges. And so I wouldn't say we were unprepared. I would, to summarize, say that our scarce resources were prioritized in different ways in the years leading up to this pandemic, and that inherent in military capability lies the ability to contribute significantly in pandemics to both slow the spread of the pandemic and to respond to the point of need. And I think we were slow as individual nations, but also slow potentially as an alliance to leverage those.
So I hear what you're saying, that because you can't know what your next battle is going to be, all militaries have to essentially be a little bit of a Swiss Army knife with a lot of capability, but it's up to nation states and the alliance structures to call on that capability. So that's where the military and alliance response fell down this time.
I think so. I think, Kim, we were slow. We were slow to ask of that capability. I think we were slow to recognize the severity, if you will, of the pandemic worldwide, and nations were, at least initially, largely left to fend for themselves without the kind of coordination that could have occurred within a larger alliance, and resources that could have been committed by individual nations to that alliance. The strength of many is much greater than the strength of few, and the alliance is certainly a sum of all of its parts. And so there were some niche capabilities as well that exist within militaries that were not emphasized because of the priority in the irregular warfare fight. Like chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear type defenses that could have been more contributory to slowing the spread, and or as it was spreading, to try to decrease the spread of it. And so I would concur with what you said. Yes.
Well, I want to get into later. We've got a new surge coming, so how can alliances be deployed? But Juan, I would love to hear why you think we seemed to be so caught off guard, despite having an Ebola pandemic that has only just been defeated for the 11th or 12th time in the DRC, and the earlier SARS virus that was so devastating across Asia.
Exactly. Thank you, Kimberly, and have a happy Thanksgiving Day. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Policy Center for the New South for the invitation to dialogue with you. The good part as being the third one is that I can concur with the previous colleague and distinguished colleagues about what they said. Let me add the idea of the great rhino. For example, we all knew that the crisis was incoming, but we diminished the possibilities of the impacts of the current crisis. So what happened in Latin America, and I suppose that in Africa too, the Latin America had several another health issues like Zika, like dengue, like the SARS, for example. We live under regional health crisis, so that is important because the priority was located in other areas, and the military was contributing to that another areas of health problem. That's why we are quite prepared as a Latin American people to be ready to respond to not to the COVID crisis, but to the quarantine options of policy. The other issue that I consider important is that with the so limited public health system, we actually, as a Latin American people, we pray that the crises were contained in the north, and that's completely failed because of the condition of the crisis. So that creates a lot of problems for our governments, and they have to use the military to contain the effect of the COVID. So we are prepared to respond, as Barre said, but we are prepared to respond for the quarantine part, not for the COVID part of the problem. And the last part is that, honestly, as a Latin American people, we were looking to the 2019 political turmoil, for example, in Chile, Ecuador, Peru, and in the case of Argentina, the economic troubles creates a lot of another priorities for us, and the COVID was completely out of the radar in the first part of the situation. So that's the reason why we got a little bit off guard in this situation.
So we can't say that we're surprised now. We have a new surge. How should alliances be used now to tackle it? Who would like to start?
Well, let me say two things. For example, in South America, we do not have any military alliance. If you look at the Central American part, they have to rely on the U.S. Southern Command for military assistance, and the Southern Command, the military assistance from the U.S. was quite important in that it's now called as a pandemic diplomacy. So the Southern Command bring a lot of resources, a lot of military and medical resources to fight the COVID crisis in Central America. In South America, the Southern Command was a little bit important because our military structure has two important capabilities. One is health services. If you want to go to combat, you have to provide health services, and our military have to do that. And also food services, which was quite important when the quarantine was established. Unfortunately, communication among Southern American military was quite low, was effective in controlling frontiers, in trying to address the new threats kind of situation like guerrillas observation or other kind of movement in Latin American criminal movement. But they must talk a little bit further about how to improve what we have as a region in terms of military capabilities.
Apologies. So there is a new surge. How would the military might of the United States or alliances be used perhaps come January when we have a new Biden administration?
Is that specific to anybody, Kim, or
Barry, if you'd like to jump in.
Respond. Okay, yeah. So I think there's a number of ways. You know, one of the great strengths of military organizations, and it was leveraged within NATO in particular, and certainly within the United States, is the military's ability to plan. And the military's been doing that both in the United States, plans via Northern Command, plans via European Command situated there in Stuttgart. And NATO's been following suit. And a lot of these baseline plans that these major commands within these geographic combatant commands have within the United States have been sharing the portions of the plans that they can with NATO to further develop a comprehensive pandemic response plan within NATO. In addition, I think one of the great strengths of military organizations is the ability to consolidate and leverage best practices. And so there's a system in place within NATO that's captured best practices of the alliance, best practices of the individual countries that are contributing to the alliance and are willing to share those. And those best practices will certainly both inform plans, but will ensure action going forward. Additionally, there's an array of other military options that the alliance individual nations have at their disposal. That includes, if directed by within NATO, the medical personnel augmentation to nations. They can deploy expeditionary military capabilities that are medical capabilities. There's the air, ground, and sea transport that I've spoke about previously that helps to get needed supplies to the point of need. And they can deploy the decontamination teams. That gets back to the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear that I had spoke about previously. And God forbid, mortuary affairs support teams, to name a few capabilities that exist both within countries as well as the alliance as a whole. And so all that, of course, is bound by the level of ambition of the individual countries in terms of their willingness to contribute to the alliance, vice have that capability directed inwardly, if you will. We're all hearing, and this is not my opinion, but I'm reading that the Biden administration, to get back to your question, is going to be more internationalist in focus. And so my guess would be that the United States would rejoin the World Health Organization, and that what we'll see is a desire and perhaps leadership for even greater cooperation worldwide in terms of the capabilities that are available, and from a military perspective, and applying those both to support the alliance, but also to support partners and others worldwide in need.
If I may add a second just to what Barry was saying, I think that when you look at the second wave or the surge or what will happen next with the COVID pandemic, what we may have lacked in preparation, at the same time, as he pointed out, we had a number of assets throughout the alliance that could be used in a response to that. And we are now better prepared to use them. For example, at Brussels level, we have what we call the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center, which is a kind of exchange hub, which tries to receive a request of support from allies and partners and to provide them with the means through the contribution of willing allies and partners. Now, this is much more better tailored to work in response to the COVID pandemic. I think there has also been a shift, or not, if not a full shift, there has been a bigger reassertion of the issue of resilience. While we were more focused on deterrence, now we're also giving and developing initial discussions that we had on resilience. So how do we keep our governments, our institutions, our agencies working even under the stress of a pandemic or of a kind of global disaster or health challenge? So what I see as the evolution is that we're better and better able to leverage these assets and these strands of policy that were already existing in the organization and bring them into play in the service of the fight against COVID.
That also brings me to the question of the job that the alliances and militaries writ large were doing. How much did the pandemic, or has the pandemic so far, impacted, say, training of foreign partners who were battling terrorists? To stick with you, Gabriele, has it been a problem?
No problem. I was just deferring it to some extent to Barre for the more operational part, because this is definitely something that Shape is more aware of. But for sure, a lot of the the contacts and a lot of the work that we were able to do had to be transferred to some extent into online or distance, or reducing the number of trainers on the ground, reducing the number of exercises. We're still keeping the ability to deliver on our mission. And there also has been probably a bit of a learning curve, as it has been from headquarters perspective, a learning curve, the idea of how do we adjust decision-making to the challenge of a pandemic, because you are no longer, I mean, I come from an organization which lives around the daily meetings of diplomats and senior military officers in committee, and all of a sudden, all of that is transferred to distance or online platform. Even the meetings among the senior decision makers take place in the form of VTCs. So there has been a process of adjustment. But what I think, and this is probably an area where I would say we have not been unprepared, what I think has been a very fast reaction is that of saying the priority is the continuation of the mission. So we can, like others, move as far as we can to teleworking, to distance communication, but we need to ensure that whatever we do is geared towards being able to continue to deliver and to continue in achieving our operation. So I think that's an area where we clearly had to cut down to some extent, but we have been able to maintain the ability to deliver what we're doing.
Barry, how about from your perspective in terms of, you know, since Gabriele is especially talking about things at the strategic end, the discussions of how you would go about creating or carrying out policy or continuing to form policy. How about the sharp end, training, advising, assisting forces in Afghanistan who are hunting Al-Qaeda and ISIS? Same thing with NATO forces in Iraq, NATO forces in places like, well, parts of Africa. I mean, did the pandemic slow it down for a minute?
Yeah, Kim, thanks. Yeah, so I think a short answer would be, I like how Gabriele phrased it, and that is what we needed to do, and what ended up occurring within the alliance is we scaled activities. And so we looked for ways to still accomplish, and we were able to still accomplish those activities that were required for deterrence and defense, certainly the core of the mission of the alliance. But things like Under 20, which was a U.S. sponsored exercise, it was supposed to be the largest number of forces that deployed from the United States to Europe in some 25 years, and then NATO countries were going to leverage training opportunities with the deployment of those forces, you know, ranging much of Europe, actually. Those opportunities were scaled back. We found that however, we did find that as we got pockets of COVID positives within military organizations, that they were very quick to respond to them. So the command and control, the empowerment of the military leaders were able to contain the COVID within the forces to really prevent our inability to do what's needed to be done in order to continue to deter and to be ready. So readiness remained key, and we continue to focus on readiness and continue to focus on readiness, as I now view it from a senior mentor perspective. And so, you know, as I sit here I'm actually in the United States right now, and as I see the governors try to issue edicts within their respective states, I see a lot of non-compliance. Well, the benefit of the military is that when you're told to do something, very typically you do it, or there are repercussions for not doing it. And so there's a very well-established command and control that allows that readiness to remain very high, even in the midst of a pandemic. To get more specific, to respond more specifically to your question on soft training, which I think was at the opening of this question series, we continue to train, and NATO continues to train those that are deploying to ensure that they receive what they need in order to deploy and accomplish the mission. And so that has gone on throughout the pandemic. In particular, some of those, I wouldn't say niche, but specialized skill sets like soft training that needed to continue to occur. It certainly did. In Afghanistan and in Iraq.
By soft, you mean special operations?
And perhaps I can follow up later. I'm sorry. Yeah, you bet. Sorry. No military acronyms and jargon, right? Rule one in these. So yes, special operations forces that we're deploying in order to accomplish the mission, particularly in the irregular warfare settings of Afghanistan, in particular with respect to NATO and in the United States elsewhere, to include Iraq and Syria. The training they received was comparable to what they were receiving before the pandemic in order to prepare them to deploy. So that never ceased. Afghanistan and Iraq's a very long answer. I can maybe start the conversation on that and give others a chance, but I'll start with Iraq. So Iraq was a challenging situation for NATO because of the complexities of what was going on with the government over the last year, as well as as exacerbated by the pandemic. And so mission-wise, which it's a training mission there in Iraq for NATO, what we saw was the inability to continue at the level at which we were conducting the training, and the need actually, based on the safety of NATO forces, as well as the impacts of the pandemic, to remove a large number of forces out of Iraq proper to another location in the Mideast, in attempts to continue that mission, as Gabriele pointed out, at the strategic level, virtually while working their way back into Iraq proper. And so there was this constant commander assessment of troop safety, deployed forces from their safety relative to the environment politically, and with the attacks on the locations with which they were deployed to, and as well as the pandemic impact that significantly impacted training, but did not cause the mission to stop. In Afghanistan, as we all have read in the news, the United States continues to draw down, and if the current president is able, it sounds like that'll go to a fairly small number by 20 January. And so NATO nations in very close planning and command and control of the forces that NATO nations have contributed have been working very, very closely within the alliance and with the United States on that drawdown. And what it's caused within Afghanistan, the military to have to do, not caused, but it's a logical progression, if you will. So is to start to elevate the mentoring, elevate from the tactical level up to the strategic level. And so while handing much more over to the much more capable Afghans to execute the tactical level fight on their own, with continued advisement at, again, the operational and strategic levels of command and control. And so a lot less kind of frontline, if you will, engagement with the forces, a lot more of the Afghan forces not going it alone, but being advised and assisted at higher levels while they're demonstrating proficiency at the tactical level to accomplish the mission.
I see. So the pandemic has operated as a sort of a forcing function to encourage more independence and assumption of the training skills that previously were being provided by the outside. So that's fascinating. Juan.
I think that's true, but I think it's a combination, Kim. It's a combination, I think, both of a very short response here, but it's a combination of the pandemic as well as the strategic direction of the agreement the United States made with the Taliban, and the current United States president focus on drawing down the forces there. So the combination of those things have really seen a shift from the tactical to the strategic. And in my personal assessment, having been there from 2018 to 2019, commanding our NATO air forces in Afghanistan, I would say that it's an appropriate time, from an Air Force perspective, for us to be moving in that direction. And yes, I would agree with you, the pandemic as well as the United States Taliban agreement very likely accelerated that. I think that's a very...
Got it. Thank you. Juan, I'm curious to hear your response. I'm also curious about militaries in Latin America. When I was a young journalist, the stories that came out about Latin American militaries writ large, and I'm making an assumption about a whole continent, which is a dangerous thing to do, but the majority of the stories were negative. Does the military in Latin America writ large now have a tradition like the US military, like NATO, of disaster assistance in addition to both its counterterrorism, policing, and nation-state defense function?
Thank you. That is important what you said, because it shows us how different Latin America is if you consider what Barre and Gabriele said previously. First of all, Latin America tried to make an alliance under the South American Defense Council, trying to work what they were capable of, which was natural disaster response and especially overseas deployment under the United Nations missions. So if you look at the 90s, the militaries from Latin America gained a lot of experience doing peacekeeping operations in places like Congo, for example, Uruguay, like Haiti, in the case of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, in places like the former Yugoslavia, where the Argentine military were deployed. And most of the time, we have to deal with the humanitarian crisis, with aspects that we are quite well trained right now. For example, if you consider the 2010 earthquake of the Haiti, well, the first responder was the United States military and the Canadian, but the way to the help was implemented by doing it through the Latin American military, especially with Brazil, with Argentina. And that gave you a lot of experience to work when the lockdown were imposed by our state, and we should use our military to maintain some kind of order in the street. And the military was quite well prepared to do that. And that brings to your second question, which is because of the good work of the militaries in general in the region. I'm speaking about the Argentine, but also the Brazilian forces and the Chilean forces in this case, that are what I know best. Let me say that the military improved their image. You have a lot of good tales about how military help the government, how military brings relief to the people, to the most needed. For example, those who were placed in complex urban environment. If you look at the military was under peacekeeping operation in the worst complex environment that they were deployed, and when the government used the military here, they should be deployed in the exact same condition, because Latin America has a lot of poverty geographies, if I'm trying to be clear. So the image of the military in South America is quite good. It's around 60%, between around 60 and 65% of good image. It's quite a place where in the incoming economic crisis post-COVID in South America, most of people look at the military as a good job, as a good way to stay afloat, also to receive a good medical health. So that is important. This is a part of social, a social reproduction or social capability to maintain as a middle class man or to go out to the poverty. The military right now is a good way to improve our future life if you consider the conditions of the economic crisis that is going to arrive in Latin America in 2021. So the military was capable of capitalize the crisis, and I'm not sure if they are going to receive the funds that they need to have a modern military. And there is a problem there because most of the military are going to receive funds to maintain a good logistical capability that was used quite a lot in the case of Argentina, in the case of Brazil, also in Colombia and Peru. And one important question in military terms, in the terms that Barre and Gabriele told us, which is going to be Venezuela. Venezuela could be in 2021, 2023, an interesting scenario to deploy peacekeeping operations under social turmoil and under economic disruption. So I think that we should look at the Venezuela, because Venezuela is one of the worst places to get sick of COVID, and probably the military is going to be used, the Latin American military is going to be used in Venezuela under the terms that Barre and Gabriele said. And let me add one last thing. One of the major allies to the Latin American government was the American government, in the sense that they were ready to help in the case of Central America, because we have a security interdependence with the United States. So that is important, but also is the geopolitical condition around the world right now, because the Chinese military was quite quickly to also to try to address this idea of pandemic diplomacy through helping Latin American governments using military resource to Latin American countries. Thank you.
So a quick follow-up, Juan. When you say peacekeeping forces could be deployed in Venezuela, are you talking about the same Venezuelan forces that have used tanks to run over protesters, or are you talking about some sort of intervention from the outside?
If you look, exactly. I'm talking about what happened if the Venezuelan government collapsed, because the military has a lot of trouble there. They have quite a modern military equipment provided by the Russian, provided by the Chinese, but the government remains unstable. The future of Venezuela is quite complicated, and they do not manage well the COVID crisis. So it is a problem for Colombia, it's a problem for Brazil also, because migrants from Venezuela still continue to move to those places. And if the government in Venezuela collapses, which is a possibility, which is a scenario, probably peacekeeping operation will be deployed that, because it is a Latin American problem. So it's a good scenario to consider because we agree that until 2023 we are going to live under the shadows of the COVID crisis.
Thank you. That's a long time and a pretty grim prediction. We're going to open up to questions from the audience in 5 minutes or so. So I want to invite those watching. Please post your questions in the comment section of either the YouTube or the Facebook live stream. But I have one more question I want to ask the panel, and that's about counterterrorism and criminal activity. Gabriele, to start with you, how has the pandemic impacted ISIS, Al-Qaeda? Has it created the same knock-on effects in their communities and tied them up? Or has the pandemic shutdown given them, and the distraction of militaries and governments, given them more room to maneuver?
Well, let me prefix my answer by saying I don't think at this stage we still have a full analysis based on hard data on the impact of the pandemic on terrorism and counter-terrorism. But there are a few kind of strands or threads that we can identify and develop. The first thing is that in many countries, the pandemic has been an obstacle to the conduct of terrorist attacks. Just imagine to the lockdowns. Terrorists want to be able to hit areas where there are many people, to have high impact, while when you enter in a situation where you have very few people out, a lot of police control, this of course is a natural obstacle to at least to the kind of attack that you want to launch. I mean, I will just quote it as a fact. I would not say it's a coincidence or it is for sure, but the recent attack in Vienna was conducted on the eve of the day when Austria was entering a lockdown, because probably that was the last day where you could still find, unfortunately, a lot of people out in the streets. At the same time, it is evident that the pandemic has created opportunities for terrorists. First of all, one of those that are less considered, but I think is important, the current terrorist groups thrives on online narratives. And our lives have become more and more online. So the space for the spreading their narrative, conducting online radicalization, I think it has increased exponentially. The other element is that we mentioned the fact that in many countries, many agencies, the army, the police, etc., have been used in reacting to the COVID crisis. Of course, everywhere, you have a situation of scarce resources for alternative goals. So if you need to help your country fight the COVID pandemic, maybe you have to divert some of the resources that you were using on tracking, monitoring, and countering terrorist groups. And finally, I think that one of the elements that are under everybody's eyes, the pandemic is causing a significant economic crisis. We still don't know how big it will be. I think, again, this will be a long-term process. We don't appreciate in full the scale of what is going to happen now. And of course, economic crisis, normally, that's been the trend, increase inequalities, increase frustration, increase some of the triggers that can motivate people to join armed struggles, terrorist groups. So it could, in a sense, create a higher fragility for countries and the possibility of better recruitment for terrorist groups. And the last consideration on what we see operationally, actually what we see is that although terrorist groups have been pretty careful about, for example, issuing to their members instructions about being careful about the pandemic, etc., but terrorist activities and the activities of terrorist groups have continued, because for many of them, especially those who are engaged on the ground, the pandemic is just another professional risk. When you're at war and you're at risk of being shot and you're at risk of being captured, well, okay, on top of this, you also have the pandemic, but what we see is that the groups that are operating, for example, look at Al-Shabaab in Somalia or in the Sahel, they've not just disappeared or gone into lockdown themselves because of the pandemic. So the reality is they continue to operate, probably with adjusted circumstances, but their threat is still very present. We have new threats. We've seen what is happening with Mozambique. So the terrorist threat is still there, is still active, and has not been, let's say, curbed by the pandemic.
Barre, how about in the areas that NATO really focuses on, Afghanistan, Iraq? Is this something you've been tracking?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. First off, Juan. Really interesting and insightful on Venezuela, and thank him for sharing that. And Gabriele certainly illuminated a lot with respect to the question you just asked in an extremely insightful way. And I was almost going to say nothing to add to what he said, because it was so comprehensive. But a couple thoughts based on you asking to kind of focus in from an operational / strategic military headquarter level, if you will. Our initial assessment was that COVID was largely being ignored by these groups, and there was some sense of accepted attrition relative to the pandemic, and some sense that at least within the populations that they were trying to control, that it was either they were attempting to use it to their advantage in terms of that political or power type relationship with the areas in which they were trying to control, and or they were trying to de-emphasize it because it was severely affecting the populations, and or attribute it to obviously the foreign forces that were operating within their borders. And so there's certainly disinformation, and I think we may talk about that later, but associated with this, that the groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda are trying to leverage, desperately trying to leverage, and actually are pretty good at doing so. From an operational strategic perspective, one of the big keys with respect to Al Qaeda and ISIS and NATO Strategic Direction South in particular, which has indicators and warnings associated with that challenge or problem set, is the continuance of valid and insufficient quantity indicators and warnings to the strategic headquarters. And what we're seeing is, as allied activities decrease in some ways, to include the exercises, which we discussed earlier, which have been scaled back, those kinds of activities generate indicators and warnings, whether it be with respect to great power competition or with respect to, as I said, these terrorist groups and their activities. However, even though some of that might have decreased relative to the amount of activity that we're seeing, we're also seeing a greater number of nations step up and provide indicators and warnings to the alliance in particular. And so the conglomeration of all those indicators and warnings is really what gives the situational awareness to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe and the ability to make decisions relative to deter and defend, and also relative to activities within the AOR's areas of responsibility in which these groups are operating, Afghanistan, Iraq, and beyond, and as Gabriele pointed out, in Africa. I think I would point to, as my last point on this, the fact that the Taliban, if you look at Afghan specific, number of attacks have not decreased significantly, and in fact, in some ways have increased based on what I would assess to be their desire to leverage the most that they can get out of the intra-Afghan negotiation and dialogues, which are start and stop, but are ongoing. And so if the number of attacks statistically are an indication, my assessment, at least in Afghanistan and relative to NATO forces that are there, is that it's having somewhat minimal impact, and the emphasis that they have on recruiting and replacing those that are lost either to the pandemic or to the fighting itself remains robust. And Gabriele stated that, and in some ways, perhaps even more so, based on the amount of time, not within Afghanistan particularly, but worldwide, people are spending on the internet as quarantine and isolation occurs, and the attempts to radicalize and recruit via that methodology.
Fascinating. I hadn't thought about that spending so much time online drives them to some of the places that U.S. intelligence and other intelligence agencies have tried really hard to take down. Now, also, as you mentioned, recruiting continues, and Gabriele mentioned vaccines. There is a risk, depending on how the vaccine is rolled out, to create a sense of further inequality that can be used to recruit. But I would like to shift to, we're getting some great questions in. So Juan, while I shift to you to ask that original question about the rise of criminal and other activity, there was also one that came in for you that possibly you can combine. You had mentioned that the image of the military in South America is good at the moment. How come that's the case with all the social turmoil that's happening?
That's a good. Thank you for that question. Let me say that the ideas that Barre and Gabriele and you with your question are much more easy to say in Spanish than in English. So I'm sorry for my pronunciation and if my ideas are quite fussy at some point. But let me say that the COVID crisis was seen for the criminal cartels, for example, or for the low-level or minor guerrillas movement in Latin America as an opportunity. If you look the lockdown, each country has to implement different type of lockdowns. But the global commerce, the global transport, and the global transport, and also the flights were diminished, but not totally closed. So the guerrillas used that opportunity to move a lot of drugs, weapons, people, animals, whatever they needed, because our military was doing the important job of assisting population and also try to maintain the streets control. So it's the first different thing that when you consider Latin American as a region and as a security space. So that is the first issue. The second issue is we have, and it is related with the intelligence question that you asked. If you look at the north part of South America, the sensor capability, the satellite sensors, radars capability from the United States are central to control the Caribbean zone, also the north part of South America, but the south part of South America has a regular capability to monitor flows of air traffic and ship movements. But again, under the COVID condition, that was quite a problem for us to control everything, because we do not have the resources and the infrastructure yet in our region. And that was funny because illegal fishing in the South Atlantic was up under the COVID crisis. So, and we lost in this past 8 months, for example, Argentina lost almost $2 billion in illegal fishing. And that is country against country. You know, it's a fleet of I don't know, Taiwan, China, even Spain ships doing illegal fishing, which was quite a problem. Also, we know now that part of those fisheries fleet had inside a lot of spy ships from several countries doing intelligence reconnaissance, because if you look the South Atlantic, there is an important infrastructure from NATO in the Malvinas Island. So that was another quite interesting, not so known topic about the COVID and the security dimension. Well, about the question on the military and the social turmoil, that brings us with the issue of the disinformation and misinformation campaign, because the 2019 create the opportunity for most of center-left, left groups in some part of Latin America, for example, in Chile, also in Peru and in Ecuador, for example, to mobilize people under several of false assumptions. It's well known that Latin America has a lot of wealth divide. There are a lot of poor people. For example, in my country, Argentina, almost 45% of the people are considered poor. 15% in Chile, 30% in Ecuador, and this is a economic and a health problem, as we talked recently. So most of the people use that kind of misinformation and misperception and disinformation to mobilize people, and the police forces, and in our case, the constabulary forces and the gendarmeries, were surprised by the mobilization. So at some point, for example, in the case of Chile and Peru, they had to use the military. And the military, to be honest, did not perform very well. And there were a lot of unfortunate declarations, for example, from the Chilean president, when he said that they were at war and the military command had to say to him that they weren't at war. They are only trying to regain the control of the street. So it's a mixed picture, but how the military managed the COVID crisis surpasses the problem that the 2019 turmoil created for the military. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to pick up on that disinformation and misinformation piece. Barre or Gabriele, do you have anything to add in terms of, is there a role for the military to play in being a good information broker, especially if it comes from something like NATO, or is there a risk of this being abused in other parts of the world?
Well, looking at the NATO experience, I'm not sure if I would say there is a role for the military as such, but I'm sure that there is a responsibility from an alliance such as NATO to inform properly. It's no mystery what happened with the first wave of COVID. Of course, the initial reflex from a number of countries was to protect whatever stockpiles of equipment they had and say, we need this for us. And this was very rapidly turned into a narrative. You see, you cannot trust even your closer allies. They will not give you what you need. They're all selfish and so on. And so for us, it was very important when we started to have, and we had many cases of transfer through that mechanism, the EADRCC that I mentioned before, especially of PPE and ventilators from one NATO country to another NATO country, from NATO country to a partner, to underline that this kind of mutual help, mutual support, after all, alliances are all about solidarity, existed and was in place. But we realized that in that initial phase, there could have been a certain degree of genuine frustration, but there was a kind of machine that set itself in motion very quickly to portray, you see, NATO, the EU, they are good for nothing, you can't rely on them, when you're in trouble, they will not help you. So there is for sure a responsibility to try to restore the truth or inform properly about what is happening.
Barre, did you have something to add on that subject?
Yeah, I do, Kim, thanks. Excellent points already made, certainly, but I would say wholeheartedly the military has a role in disinformation, not in spreading it, but in countering it, and countering it quickly. And what we found in Afghanistan in particular, and so I'll talk more from the operational and maybe even strategic military headquarter level, and hopefully complement what Gabriele mentioned from the political headquarter perspective. But in ops, we found that you've got to be very, very responsive, and you know well, based on your own background, that news cycles are only so long, and then the news becomes irrelevant, and or something, you move on to something else that is the headline. And so, you know, when I first arrived at Afghanistan, we would, this was again 2018, 2019, as part of the Resolute Support Commander's staff, and a subordinate commander to him commanding all of his air forces there in Afghanistan. We were on a fairly lengthy fact gathering, wait until you had complete facts in order to respond timetable. And inevitably, the Taliban in this case, or at least mostly the Taliban, they were winning in the disinformation battle, if you will. They were winning in the narrative that that they wanted to get out, and we were unable to counter in a timely manner. And so, partway through my time there, that shifted to we need to be very responsive in hopefully, or the goal was to get out in front of even the Taliban narrative, to get the accurate narrative out of there and make it that much more difficult than to counter the accurate narrative, whether it be attacks that occurred that the Taliban would attempt to attribute to NATO forces when they were responsible for it, or the Haqqani network was responsible for it, or Al-Qaeda was responsible for it. So this, rather than wait until we had the 100% solution, all of the facts together, you know, we really went with, let's get ahead of the narrative. And if we're not ahead of the narrative, we need to quickly respond. 80% solutions, good enough, if you will. These are not hard percentages. I'm just using them metaphorically, but and if we need to correct something later, then we'll come back and make sure we do that, so the accurate data is put out there. But it's extremely important, and the military has a role, but the military can only effectively conduct that role if empowered by their civilian masters to do so, by their at the political level to do so. And so sometimes you see that there's a little tension and friction, and I'm not talking NATO specifically, albeit I have seen it there, but even within nations, about empowering the military, because obviously any information that's put out there can be used for political purposes, and in fact, arguably could be said that it's political in nature. And so it's something that very closely needs to be worked with the civilian masters of the respective militaries, both within nations, but also, and equally as important, within a large alliance like NATO.
I see. So you're torn between getting accurate information out there to protect your operations, because if you wait 12 to 24 hours to respond to a question from someone like me, and the story's already out there, it's going to be set as in the public's mind. That's going to become the narrative, and then you're on the back foot to try to correct it. But by giving that information about what you did, it has political consequences, or it can. So that brings me to an interesting question from our viewers. In many countries, the military has been involved with the distribution of PPE or enforcing quarantines. Is there a danger of having the military so involved in health policy when a vaccine emerges? Is there a concern that certain preferred groups will receive aid and others will be ignored, which would further entrench patronage? And goes back to what Gabriele was talking about in terms of the possibility for recruiting right now. Gabriele, do you want to kick us off?
Oh.
Sorry, Juan, I didn't see you.
Yeah, no, but I will be brief. I think that one thing that is clear, one thing that has emerged very clearly in all this entire crisis is that this kind of global pandemics require what we call the whole of government approach. So you cannot have only one agency dealing with it. And if the military can be helpful to play a role, it's good that they play this role. I mean, I come from a country, Italy, where until the late 80s, early 90s, we did not have a civilian civil defense, and whatever was the crisis at hand, it was the military that was called in, whether it was a earthquake, a flood, or you name it. So I think that all of the relevant agencies that can play a useful role have to be involved. I would not, but then it all depends, like you cannot make a case for 190 countries about the world. I would not say if you include the military, it can make the distribution more unequal, more than you could say if you involve certain political parties or if you involve certain institutions, it will equally may make it unequal. So I would not say that there is a special risk of inequality connected with the use of the military, for example, in supporting the various measures which are related to the response to COVID or to the distribution of vaccines. It's something that has to be dealt by the country as a whole, and it will be reflective of how unequal the country as a whole is.
Let me add that I'm completely agree with Gabriele. So the point that the viewer expressed is corruption. And the issue here is if the military are going to be able to solve the problem of, for example, South American corruption. Well, we do not know right now, but what we do know is that the military is quite effective in doing logistical issues. If you are going to fight a war, you need a logistical team, and the military was quite effective. In the case of Bolivia, in the case of Argentina and Chile, they cover all the country. All the countries need in region inaccessible to other groups or NGOs, for example. So I do not see a problem in terms of inequality. I see a problem if the distribution is going to be doing corruptly or under the corruption's assumption.
Which, of course, is going to vary from location to location. Another question that we've just had come in is, to what extent do military alliances remain resilient while COVID-19 continues to disrupt the global economy and supply chains, which is, of course, going to have a negative impact on future military spending? There are already grumblings among various think tanks in DC that the US military is going to face some budget cuts in the years to come. Who would like to dig into that first?
I will just try to give a very quick answer, and I would say that so far, and when I look at our organization, allies have been remarkably steady in their commitment. So, of course, if you have a dramatic reduction of the GDP in a country, then you cannot expect this to not to affect all various areas of public spending. And even by itself, if you say that you have a threshold of 2% of GDP devoted to defense, the moment the GDP is 10% lower, well, it's just pure mathematics. It's not even a political choice. The absolute amount will be lower. But I honestly have to say that so far we've not seen that, and like I say, we have seen a remarkable steadiness and consistency of the member states on keeping to their commitments and on honoring their commitments in defense spending.
And I suppose you probably don't want me to put you on the spot and ask if President Donald Trump's insistence that all NATO members raise their spending to 2% of the GDP has helped.
Well, the response that I can give is that this actually is a commitment that all allies took in 2014, before 2024, to reach that ceiling. And honestly, we have seen, then we will see now the impact of COVID, but we've generally seen an upward trend in the contribution to defense spending. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody has reached 2%, but everybody has started to pick up and invest more in their defense spending. Now, what is that they say in the economic sector? That the profits of the past are no guarantees for the future. So we don't know what will be the trend, and we don't know what will be the actual economic outlook once we get out of this crisis. But I think that so far, all the indicators have been in the right direction.
Now, Juan has already mentioned that very many militaries across South America, Latin America have had trouble with funding. But Juan, did you have something to add on that?
Yes, let me, in a third world, in a perspective for a middle power, if you like, or a third world military, you have two problems, two budgetary problems. The first one is to maintain current capabilities. And if those current capabilities were previously modernized, for example, Chile modernized their Air Force and Brasilia is modernizing their Air Force, that's ongoing programs are going to remain stable and they are going to receive funding. The other question is about future capabilities, how to maintain the pace of military transformation around the world. For example, the issue of have better air defense capabilities, for example, or adding artificial intelligence to our military system, or how we are going to think the ground equipment military for those kind of programs. That remains uncertain. But the real problem are for the militaries that the current capabilities are not modern at all. They can't maintain the pace of military transformation, and they are losing capabilities. And that is the case, for example, of Argentina or Bolivia. We have to, we need, because of the size of our country, the responsibilities that we have with the international community and ourselves, for example, and more traditional security issues that puts pressure to us, for example, to modernize our Air Force. And unfortunately, for the 1982 Falklands War, Malvinas War, create a problem. For example, we have the veto of the United Kingdom. We are.
Oh, I'm afraid Juan is frozen. So in the moment, while we give him a chance to shut down his camera and turn it back on, hopefully that'll fix the problem. Barre, are you bracing for cuts in spending, and how will that affect? I mean, will you be looking at things like dual use technology, things that can be used for public health scenarios as well as the military? I mean, the battlefield use.
Can you hear me now? I can hear you.
Yeah, Kim, I think Juan just came back. Do you want me to continue, or you want to go back to him?
Juan, do you want to finish that thought?
No, yes. It's finally that militaries that need modernization are going to face a lot of stress to receive the money that they need for modernize their military. So it's for us it remains unclear, because most of the money are going to be put on the logistical strain of the military, not in modern military equipment.
Got it. It's going to go to the bread and butter things that happen to be dual use for public health. And we can see you now too. Barre, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So if I could briefly go back to the distribution question, I had just a couple thoughts on that. It's kind of a cliche, but really the role of the alliance is whatever the alliance needs the military to be. And so with the environment being so very fluid and problems being varied and complex, there's really no fixed formula or playbook in terms of using the military for distribution. But the military really can help to fill gaps and buttress civilian response efforts with expeditionary military capabilities, as mentioned previously, command and control, mobility support, and even medical assets when called upon to do so. Some additional thoughts on that is, at least in the United States and of course within the alliance, the military must remain subservient within the NATO alliance to civilian masters. And so distribution must remain a political decision. It should not be put into the hands of the military. It is truly a political decision. And while there's still potential for corruption, as I think Juan spoke to, it must remain a political decision. Now, from a military perspective, my hope would be that nations would prioritize getting those to military members, because part of national security is the health of military forces. And so the inability for military forces to perform their given missions, and with the alliance to deter and defend in great power competition, as well as terrorist groups, this is going to be absolutely baseline to the health of those forces and their ability to continue to do those strategic mission sets. So in terms of resilience, and then you talked about funding, I think it really comes down to a matter of prioritization. So at least within the United States, as we look at the path that we've been on a path of really focusing modernization with an emphasis on readiness toward great power competition, in particular as we've drawn down in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And the attempt to influence within the alliance has been for other nations to do the same. And so many nations, via their multi-year budgeting cycles, have put themselves on a path where they're both looking already at modernization within the alliance, looking at adding capability that's much needed and maybe doesn't exist in great enough measure relative to the alliance capabilities as a whole. And so can those be affected by, as Gabriele very aptly pointed out, decrease in GDP obviously is going to result in a decrease in the tax base for each nation, and therefore decrease in budget and what they're able to spend. I think absolutely it can. But I think most nations are on a very solid trajectory right now toward modernization. Readiness has been emphasized for many, many years. And so I think what you would hear the Supreme Allied Commander Europe say, if he were asked that question, that he doesn't get into the 2% GDP. What he gets into is capability and readiness. And that those, from a military perspective, that's what he's concerned about. The 2% GDP, of course, is a political emphasis with ramifications and repercussions down to the strategic, operational, military, and tactical level within the militaries. But I think we're on a good path towards resilience, with great optimism about 2021 relative to our ability to learn to live with COVID with a vaccine as part of that mix. And I say learn to live with because I don't think any of us are naive enough to think that it's just going to all of a sudden go away and we're going to be able to completely control it solely based on a vaccine. And I think our militaries are at the forefront of learning to live with COVID, getting back to my lessons learned comments previously. And therefore, I think greatly resilient, and it just going to have to be very cautious about the effect of funding going forward to ensure prioritization is made.
Especially as public health experts have warned, this has been the worst pandemic in 100 years, but it probably won't take the next pandemic 100 years to get here. I want to combine two questions we've gotten from our viewers, picking up on the great power competition point. One person asks, how would alliance members respond to a severe pandemic outbreak in an IDP or refugee camp where governments won't cooperate, or where great power competition with China and Russia complicate matters? And on the flip side of that is, are there opportunities to build relationships with non-alliance members through pandemic-related operations? And if so, which countries or areas? So, Juan, do you want to jump in on that one?
No, because I do not have the experience. the only thing that I would like to say or to add or to the question is that great power competition is a kind of an issue right now, because it has a security dimension in Latin America, and as I told you, China and Russia are quite compromised in creating infrastructure in Latin America related to their security. The pandemic proves that they want to compete in terms of military soft power, using aid as a tool of statecraft. And I think that there is not much space for cooperation in the near future among China, Russia, and the United States in issues related to the pandemic, because you do not have a lot of resources to put in other places, except and using it with your allies. So I think there is not much room for cooperation.
Thank you. Gabriele, we already have this situation in a sense with the camps along inside Syria, along the Turkish border, with rising cases of COVID and difficulty getting aid there. What do you do in that situation? Because that leads to that ripe recruitment opportunity that you mentioned.
Yes, absolutely. Also, I would prefix again, this is not something where NATO is directly involved, so it's important to give that caveat. But I'm sure that, I mean, I could see allies for sure helping in this kind of mission or operation if it were necessary. Again, it's very interesting. Barre said it very aptly. He was referring to the military, but it refers to NATO as a whole. NATO does what its member states want it to do. So if one day they were to decide we want to take a more proactive role in, well, then the organization would have to get ready to do it. In terms of cooperation on the pandemic with other countries, I think this would be desirable, but this brings me a bit back from a slightly different angle to the issue of disinformation. Yes, but there needs to be then transparency. You know, what we saw in this pandemic was that probably in the beginning, the sharing of information, even between countries among who was worst affected, what was happening, what were the trends, there were probably issues of self-image that came into the way of what should be the open and transparent and scientific communication of information. So I think it has improved. We saw that the vaccine was largely the result of the speed with which the RNA of these virus was made public and available worldwide. So we saw already there a kind of example of working together and making the fundamental data that then allowed the commercial development of the vaccine available to everybody. But I think that there is this initial probably step to kind of overcome that this cooperation, we should have it, it's desirable, but then you should also be willing to share all the information, even those that can be embarrassing or unpleasant for countries about the real situation of the pandemic in their borders or the diffusion and so on.
Thank you. Barry, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, Kim, you bet. I picked up on Gabriele's transparency comment and certainly agree with that. In terms of building relationships with non-alliance members, absolutely. And I think, you know, what you've seen already in the pandemic response is NATO and allied nations and partners have coordinated transport of aid to partners such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Colombia, Georgia, Iraq, Republic of Moldova, Mongolia, Serbia, and Ukraine, just to name a few. And so these were certainly opportunities and will remain opportunities in what I think you described as the second wave or preparation for or execution within a second wave. I would also say that great power competition does not mean no cooperation. And so we often get stuck in the paradigm that we can't cooperate in the midst of great power competition, but every day we see at least glimmers of light and examples of that. One of which you might say was Russia's delivery of ventilators to New York City. Of course, there's more to that story, but I leave it there as an example of at least a narrative that came out of cooperation between great powers. I also think that it certainly isn't the military's job to forcefully go into these kinds of places. I would place it more squarely on the institutions, in particular the international institutions that we have, that should be brokering, if you will, should be negotiating, should be advocating for engagement where engagement is needed to lessen the severity of suffering or to save human lives. And the IDP camp certainly qualify as that. And so I would cite organizations like the UN and others that need to be at the forefront of access to these locations, where then militaries, via the inherent capabilities that we've already described over the last hour and a half, could use those to assist when political masters deem it appropriate to do so.
Thank you. Well, we have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to give each of you about a minute to wrap up, but answer a question from the audience and from me. How are we consolidating lessons learned among militaries and alliances? And what has the enemy learned in terms of the efficacy of a bioweapon from how this pandemic laid so many militaries low? Juan, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you. First of all, for me, the most important part was the experience that the South American and in general, the military obtained from the peacekeeping operation from the 90s and the early 2000s. I think that they were quite important because it was all capitalized by the military under the condition of the COVID-19 situation. First, that is the first one. The second one, which is an important question, is that globalization create the room for considering weapons of mass destruction, like the weapons of bioweapons, for groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or another type of group, an emergent group, because has the capability to stop us, to paralyze in a sense that we need to think the unthinkable, and the disease is the attack from a disease is quite difficult for us to identify as an attack. It's a situation, a kind of situation that you do not know it was the force of nature or it was the force of humans. So it created a room for that kind of discussion. And the other important issue is that the military is not going to pass as some kind of people thoughts about the military. The military is part of the global system. The alliances are quite important in the interconnected world, and we have to learn how to work together more efficiently to receive the help that we need. And finally, the pandemic showed us also in security terms, but also in the military, that there is a global divide, and it's hopefully the militaries are going to be able to talk more frankly about how security-related issues are connected among them and how they are going to face it in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. And so that we stay on time, Gabriele and Barre, you each have about 20 seconds. Gabriele, go.
Okay, so I'll stop at the first one and say that definitely the lesson learned is that we have learned at political level to have a much bigger focus on resilience, not only meaning resilience from a cyber attack or from a terrorist attack, but also resilience to the consequences of a global pandemic. And this is something that I think will now be much more factored into the work of the Alliance.
Thank you. Barry, bring us home.
Okay, Kim, thanks. So briefly responding to the lessons learned, NATO SHAPE headquarters has a lessons learned database that they're keeping in close coordination with the headquarters down in Norfolk, Virginia, the NATO headquarters. And so that's being both populated by nations within NATO, but also shared with nations within NATO. Let me conclude just by thanking Atlantic Dialogue and yourself, Kim, for the invitation to share in this discussion, and conclude by saying military forces have a key role to play. However, we just have to continue to realize the scale and ambition has to be grounded in the ability and willingness of nations to contribute those forces, particularly when it comes to an alliance. And contributions from nations enable everything that an alliance does or could do to facilitate support to both allies and partners, as you critically pointed out, that are most in need. And so thanks again for the opportunity. Really enjoyed our hour and a half together and the time with Gabriele and Juan. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists and to the Policy Center for the New South for hosting this episode of the Atlantic Dialogues. Keep safe and well, everyone.